Hi everyone, my name is Emily Scahill. I am a cyber operations planner within the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC, at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And I'm joined here today by my JCDC colleague, Matt Grote, as well as Sarah Pawazek, who is the Program Director of Public Interest Cybersecurity at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and Adrian Oji, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the Cyber Peace Institute. So, as a lot of you probably know, our mission at CISA is to understand and mitigate both the physical and cyber threats to the critical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. And to do the cybersecurity part of that mission, we need two things. The first is we need cybersecurity talent across the government and across the nation to understand and respond to the evolving threat landscape. And the second thing we need is organizations of all sizes, both big and small, across the US to be equipped to implement cybersecurity hygiene measures as well as respond to incidents. And both of those requirements are a challenge. You might not necessarily know it from roaming the halls of RSA, where there are literally thousands of cybersecurity professionals, but US cyber policy and strategy really continues to emphasize the need for us to grow the cybersecurity talent pipeline. And at the same time, we have local organizations that are providing critical public services, from your local school district to your local water utility. And a lot of these organizations don't necessarily have the resources to compete with the private sector to attract and retain cybersecurity talent and to be implementing enterprise-level cybersecurity solutions. And so that's where cyber volunteer organizations like the ones that Sarah and Adrian run are incredibly important to making an impact on the cyber ecosystem. Because they not only play a critical role in serving these under-resourced organizations, but they also help to build that cybersecurity talent pipeline. So before we turn to Sarah and Adrian to have them talk a little bit about the work that they do within their cyber volunteer organizations, I first want to turn to Matt, and I'd like to ask you a really basic question, which is that CISA is having a growing focus on what we call target-rich cyber poor or target-rich resource poor organizations. So what do we mean by that term? What are some examples of organizations that kind of fall under that bucket? And then kind of lastly, why do we care about these types of organizations even if they don't fit neatly under a particular critical infrastructure sector?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Emily. So target-rich, resource-poor, think of organizations in your community, right? A small hospital, a health clinic, a local school district, your local municipal water organization, a nonprofit that might be providing critical services to the community, like domestic abuse services or something. Even local government agencies like police or just the mayor's office or city council. While these organizations all have IT networks, but as Emily said, they don't necessarily have dedicated IT staff or cybersecurity staff to really defend them against advanced threats. And the challenge that we're facing is that in the last several years, we've seen this rise in ransomware that makes these organizations really a target for getting a target for these ransomware groups, because they'll have to pay the ransom, right? It's before they weren't that rich of a target because they only had a small amount of PII, and what can you do with selling that much PII? But ransomware really changed the game for this. I'd say too that a lot of these organizations face nation-state threats as well. That space is really evolving, and some of these organizations provide really critical services, such as water or other small utilities. And in some cases, there are nonprofits that are targeted by nation-state actors for supporting dissidents or journalists that are calling out certain authoritarian regimes. For us, it's CISA, it's a real challenge because when we think of big-scale critical infrastructure like a regional power company or a large bank, it's easy to have one-on-one relations with them and know what kind of team we can send out. But with target-rich, resource-poor, we're really talking about millions of organizations across the country. So how does CISA even think about scaling what we do to reach all of them? And that's why we're really excited to partner with volunteer organizations and make that work.
Yeah, and so I think that's the perfect segue. So Sarah, I think I'll start with you. Can you just kind of lay the foundations of your work at CLTC and the Citizen Lab and talk about where you draw your volunteers from and how you connect them with organizations in need?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Emily, and thanks all of you for being here today. I have to start off by talking about what cyber clinics are before I tell you what ours does. So raise your hand if you've heard before about clinics in medical schools or law schools. Handful of you, okay. It's a similar concept except for cybersecurity. So we're actually training higher education students, undergrad and graduate students, to do basic cybersecurity services for community organizations in need. Because similar to medical school clinics and law school clinics, there are lots of community-based organizations that don't have cybersecurity talent, that don't have the money to invest in it, that don't know where to start, and that simply can't afford the cost of getting in-person help that they need in cybersecurity. So cybersecurity clinics are wonderful. We have the Citizen Clinic at UC Berkeley, which I'm very fortunate to advise. Our students work with nonprofits at risk of politically motivated cyber attacks. So think refugee assistance organizations, LGBTQ advocacy organizations, women's health clinics, those types of organizations that might be the target of by their own government, by other nation states. So they're thinking a lot about privacy, about encrypted communications. But we're also proud to be the administrative home of the Consortium of Cybersecurity Clinics. So we help coordinate between over 15 clinics at institutes of higher education across the country, and we're expanding internationally as well. So we're fortunate to get to coordinate from schools like Stillman College to the University of Georgia to MIT, schools all across the country that have slightly different focuses. Some of them work with municipalities, some of them work with small hospitals. We're seeing an increasing focus on small utilities like electric co-ops and wastewater treatment plants. So it's a really excellent program that both gives students the hands-on experience that they need to go from a degree in maybe computer science or cybersecurity to an actual job, and also a way of helping these low-resource organizations who really need advice at the level that students can provide. Things like learning about multi-factor authentication and regular patching schedules, things that we know to be important but that they might not have ever heard of before. Those students are able to come in and explain them to them and handhold and really teach them about maybe the first 3 to 5 things that they need to do to start improving their cyber defenses.
Awesome, thanks Sarah. And Adrian, can you talk a little bit about the Cyber Peace Institute and the way that you're structured, because it's definitely a bit different than the university consortium model?
Sure, thanks a lot, Emily. And hi everyone. So I work for the Cyber Peace Institute, which is a non-profit based in Switzerland, in Geneva. And we run a program called the Cyber Peace Builders that matches cybersecurity experts coming from industry to non-profits. So where Sarah is drawing students to help those organizations, the cyber poor, target rich organizations, we're drawing professionals from industry, like potentially some of you here today, to help those organizations. So we're working with companies like MasterCard, like Microsoft, like Adobe, with Secure, you may know in Europe, or Logitech and others, some of them obviously in IT and cyber, but all others also in banking or in retail, and a variety of organizations, big and small. We have big groups, as I mentioned, but also smaller organizations that see a clear benefit in providing support to those organizations for free. They do so for a couple of hours, right? Those are volunteers, so corporate security professionals don't have a lot of time, so the constraints of our program are slightly different than the ones that Sarah is leading. And so our volunteers are going to do shorter engagements, which means that the types of jobs they do are slightly different, but nonetheless can add up to a lot. We've helped already over 270 nonprofits around the world, many of them here in the US. And so, yeah, we work with those companies with contractual engagements, right? But we have to structure this in those terms to protect liability, exchange of confidential data, and all of these aspects. But we also have contractual engagements with the nonprofits themselves. So it's a fairly well-structured program that's scalable because we do not incur exponentially increasing costs as the stakeholders that we match increase. We're like a dating platform at the end of the day, except that we're not in the business of personal relationships, but business relationships. Maybe I'll stop here for now and hand back over.
Perfect. Yeah. So it strikes me that you both have different, very innovative models for connecting volunteers with organizations that are in need. And I think really the common focus here is on those target-rich, resource-poor organizations. And so I think one thing I'm curious about is what are common cybersecurity challenges or trends that you see in your engagements with these types of organizations? And could you provide maybe a couple examples of different types of organizations that you've engaged with and kind of some of the most interesting lessons learned from those interactions? And Sarah, I'll start with you.
Oh gosh, there's so many. I would say the first challenge that folks usually run into is prioritization, especially when you're talking about organizations that are providing a critical function like hospitals, like utilities. Every dollar spent towards something like cybersecurity is a dollar taken away from the direct services that they're providing to the community. And that is extremely hard to justify, especially in the nonprofit world where the funding mechanisms that they have outline specific amounts of money that can be spent for overhead that goes to basically pay the salaries of everybody who's working there. That money often can't be spent towards cybersecurity, so they have to find really creative ways of siphoning off small amounts of funding to go towards cybersecurity. So there's just a lot of really intricate problems that these sort of small but very critical community-based organizations are facing, and trying to justify cybersecurity, even though it's so important, trying to justify that expense against purchasing more hospital beds or purchasing like really, really extensively needed medical equipment is very difficult, and that's something we run into. That's something that we have to work with them on and try and find creative solutions. Like, can we recommend a template that's free online that you can use to create your incident response plan? Can we write it for you? Really, it takes a lot of creativity, and I'll give a shout out to all the folks on the panel trying to coordinate resources to give out for free. Those sort of toolkits can be very useful when you give them to someone who can explain them. So things like, I'll say the other piece is, understanding is very difficult. We're used to working with these really intricate cybersecurity frameworks like NIST, CSF, and the CIS controls. That is not at the level that someone who is a part-time IT manager in addition to their full-time job can digest and understand. That sort of translation is a service that we think is sorely needed and something that we think students can really play a part in. But I would say that services, I think there's a real market gap there where there aren't a lot of folks able to provide that translation. And so for folks who don't have a full-time cybersecurity staff member, they're just not able to consume that same cybersecurity information.
Yeah, I'll build on that. There's multiple layers of issues affecting cyber poor target-rich organizations. Prioritization is definitely one of them. The shortage of talent that's affecting our industry is obviously building into that, because if you don't have people inside the organization to tell you what to prioritize, then it's very difficult to make those priority calls. In the organizations we work with, I wonder if it's the same in municipalities here in the US or SLTTs, but the top leadership tends to have a level of digital literacy that's fairly low, and so prioritizing technology is always hard when it comes to prioritizing purchase of medical equipment or other types of devices or spendings that are more core to the mission than IT or cyber. A lot of the people that we talk to are finance directors and have no experience in IT, and so for them cybersecurity is something fairly obscure. When we talk to nonprofits, a lot of them also thought, and this was the case up until very recently, I think the big hack against the international community, the Red Cross 2 years ago, really was a wake-up call. But in the community, a lot of people were thinking, why would we get attacked? We're doing good, we're helping people. Why would anyone target us, right? Well, the answer is, you're connected to the internet, you're gonna get targeted at one point or another. A lot of the nonprofits that we see are getting hit by ransomware, not because criminals are necessarily yet purposefully targeting nonprofits because they want to do evil on people that are doing good, no. But they're renting infrastructure, they're targeting anything they can, and NGOs get caught in the net. And when criminals realize that they hit an NGO, the answer we've seen is, oh, sorry, we didn't know, but don't worry, we'll offer you a discount. So criminals are starting to to see nonprofits as legitimate targets. And that's, if you think about it, take a step out for a second. This is crazy. It is crazy that we have built technologies that are being used to prey upon the most vulnerable in the world. Like, there's something off there, so we gotta change that. A lot of the nonprofits that we work with struggle with that issue of of talent, that issue of prioritization. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no worries. And so the volunteers, whether they're students coming from the local clinic, whether they're professionals coming from the local big or small company, really can help them make those decisions and help them start their journey. After that, they will still struggle to consume the NIST framework, but others like GCA are doing great things trying to make those frameworks a little bit more accessible. When it comes to tools, there's a bunch of tools that nonprofits can get access to. For sure, not all of them were developed with their needs in mind. So sometimes, they get the illusion of security with having very complex cybersecurity solutions that they're not actually able to use. Like I had big NGOs tell me, yeah, we have a firewall, but we've got no one looking at the alerts. So how good does it do if you've got technologies that you're not able to implement correctly? So I'm more hopeful, to your point, on the technology side though, and the process side, than on the people side, the shortage of talent. And I think, Emily, that's the direction you wanted us to take on, right? The shortage of talent is hitting our industry in the face. I don't know how you say that in English, but there's 1 million cybersecurity professionals here in the US working today, employed with, I think, around 80% in the private sector. 500,000 are unfilled jobs. We're still looking to fill 500,000 jobs. Globally, we're looking at a shortage of talent by next year of 3.5 million people. The average salary in a US nonprofit is $60K. The average salary of a cybersecurity professional, last time I checked, was 120. It's double that amount. So you make the math simple. Nonprofits are struggling to attract and retain talent, to your point earlier. And so I think that's the core issue that we got to fix now before we can help them hop on that cybersecurity journey. And then, yes, we'll be able to feed more things. Once we've got a foot through the door, whether it's through a student, whether it's through a corporate volunteer, we can start having discussions. We can start telling them, look for that tool, prioritize that. We can have more informed discussions with donors as well. When it comes to nonprofits, donors play a huge role in allocating funds that can be spent on cyber. So there's a bunch of things that we can do after, but the real core issue that we got to fix now is getting enough talent in those organizations.
So you just said so many things that I have questions about, but I think one thing that I really want to latch on to is you noted that a lot of times nonprofits don't necessarily think that they could be the target of a cyber attack. And I know that within CISA, Director Easterly very frequently says, that cyber risk is business risk. And I think when you're looking at nonprofits, cyber risk is mission risk, right? Like a lot of times these organizations are providing really critical services to vulnerable communities. And so how do you, when you're working with these organizations and they have to make these really tough choices between investing in cybersecurity and putting their money in other places that are also supporting their mission, how do you kind of communicate like the urgency of investing in cybersecurity as you're working with these organizations and helping them to understand kind of the threat that they're facing?
Yeah, I'd switch it around a little bit. I think actually a lot of the folks that we talk to are eager to learn about cybersecurity. They understand that it's important. They don't necessarily understand the mechanisms by which they become a target, but they understand that it's something that they should care about the same way they should care about connecting to the internet, that it helps them further their mission by being able to do their services better. I think that where they get stuck is they have no idea where to start. I mean, on the one hand, we're starting to develop lots of toolkits. On the other hand, there are so many toolkits. I mean, when you guys were all first starting out in cybersecurity, like where did you start? It's very, very difficult. You can't just Google, how do I understand cybersecurity? Can someone explain it all to me? There's no one single place where you can learn everything you need to know. I used to be a consultant at CrowdStrike, so I was doing these cybersecurity maturity assessments, and I just learned by doing many, many, many of them over and over again, and it seems like this secret knowledge, right? Once you know it, you sort of know the 5-10 things that every organization needs to be able to do. I think I could quiz everyone in this room and you guys would be able to tell me, but most people have no idea. And I think trying to teach that, that's the biggest barrier, is that people are eager, they just have nowhere to start and they don't have anyone to ask. We actually talked to a lot of folks and they're like, yeah, I tried to call my local police department, like I called my city councilor. People really rely on their local regional trust networks, which are not currently equipped to answer those questions on the whole. So we're doing a project right now with the city of San Francisco where we're actually working with the city and we're doing a survey of all the nonprofits in the area, and we're trying to understand, collect their questions and the resources that they would need, and then work with the city to see how we can provide them. So I think, what clinics really are is about community security, about enabling regional organizations to be able to provide that feedback to the organizations in need that live in their localities. I think trying to center it around the regions and where people live and work, those are the folks that they trust, those are the people that they're going to reach out to when they need help.
And I think I have a question based off of that too, which is, building trust takes time, it's resource intensive, it requires, one-on-one interaction. Mm-hmm. And so I think that naturally brings up a question around scalability too, right? And Matt, I know that you've talked to a lot of cyber volunteer clinics throughout your time at CISA, and so from those conversations, I'm wondering kind of what you see as the greatest areas for continued need and where government and industry can really help to support the growth of cyber volunteer programs, because it really is going to require a greater footprint, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, at CISA, we're really excited about volunteer programs. A lot of these are still nascent. We kind of see it as, look, we're still in phase 1 of cyber volunteering, and there's a long way to go, and it's going to be really powerful. For us, it helps that twofold mission of target rich, resource poor, and getting folks into the pipeline. I mean, how many folks in this room remember how hard it was to get that first cyber job? And you can't get experience until you have experience, and you can't have experience until you get experience. And that's so volunteering is a great way to solve both of those problems. I think part of the biggest challenge is funding, of course, to get these volunteer organizations off the ground. There has to be some level of structure around volunteering, right? We've seen volunteer efforts in the past that, kind of flounder because they don't have enough structure, but of course you don't want too much structure. One thing that that comes up regularly are insider threats, right? How do you stop somebody who might be malicious from joining a volunteer network? So we need some funding to have those kind of structures in place. I think too, better integration with CISA and with other parts of the federal government and local government and state and local government too. That kind of notoriety or sort of lending credibility to volunteering, it helps at all levels. Even for clinics, we've heard that, hey, if CISA starts talking about clinics and I'm the champion faculty member of the clinic, like it makes my job so much easier to get funding with an agreement within the organization, to draw clients in, to get students to participate and see it as a real opportunity. So I think those are probably the two biggest challenges going forward. But we see a lot of opportunity. This is, to borrow a phrase, in the next decade, we really want to think about how we can leverage all the talent we have to solve these kinds of problems. There's so much goodwill. How can we enable channels for everyone in this room and everybody at this conference to be able to pitch into the national effort, and to borrow a phrase of cyber civil defense, like we've done in the past whenever we have a big national emergency. So really excited about volunteering in general.
Awesome. And Adrian, I'd like to throw the same question to you, and especially from an international perspective, because Cyber Peace Institute has an international presence. What do you see as the role of governments, not only in the US, but around the globe, and industry in supporting the growth of cyber volunteerism?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And of course, I'll second what you were saying, Matt. Getting some kind of visibility from the government gives you a seal of trust that can then be extended to further your reach, and it makes it a lot easier to convince organizations to work with you. And so it's fantastic what the US is doing. I wish other governments, I'm pushing for my own government, I'm pushing for the EU to do similar things. I'm pushing CISA to talk to them as well. But yeah, getting that kind of recognition of the importance of the third sector is critical. If not, we're not going to be able to move the mountains we need to move, right? Volunteer movements, whether students-led or professionals-led, are there for the short term. They can provide for a fantastic solution short term, but long term we need policymakers to take on that issue. When I look at industry involvement, in our program at least, there are 4 ways in which industry generally gets involved. The first is send us volunteers. So this is great for companies. It's great because it allows their staff to upskill. They can learn new tricks. They can volunteer with other experts from the company or from even other companies, so they can build their network. They can get some recognition as well, which is great for their career. Volunteering is recognized by 40% of recruiters as equally important as a work experience, so it helps them build experience, as you were saying earlier about students, get them some hands-on experience. So that's one of the first ways. Send people. A lot of companies in the US have volunteer programs. We're pushing for more companies around the world to have that as well. It's not a huge tradition, for instance, where I come from, and I'm trying to change that. A second aspect is ESG, or how we call it, corporate digital responsibility. A lot of companies are trying to have a social impact mission. They are trying to do good in their communities, but sometimes it's difficult to find a topic that's safe, that's not going to create consumer backlash and whatnot. And cybersecurity is very safe. It aligns well with the interests of the companies. It's what we offer is skills-based volunteering, so you're using the skills of your experts, not asking them to do something that they're not necessarily good at or experts in. So it's a very safe way to contribute to local needs. A third way that we see companies engaging with us is providing us with free tools. And some smaller companies don't necessarily have funding to give to initiatives like these for CSR, corporate social responsibility purposes, and they don't necessarily have a lot of people to help with the volunteering effort, but they can give tools. And if they give those tools then get exposed to the community of cybersecurity professionals, and some of these tools can then be bought by the companies of those volunteers. So typically we have a tool that we use for dark web monitoring to help our volunteers look for leaked credentials on the dark web concerning the nonprofits that we work with. It's a small tool that we got for free. It's a Swiss company that does it. And one of our biggest corporations, not going to name them because it's their tech choice and I don't want to leak it, but basically this large American group decided to use that tool for their own internal purposes and so bought it. And then the fourth way in which companies generally engage with those programs, and we haven't talked much about this because it's tangential to volunteering, it's sharing threat intel. Of course you need people to help the nonprofits, but if those people don't know what is happening, have no view on what are the vulnerabilities those nonprofits are facing, then they have less to do. And if we're able to get threat intelligence from the big providers here in the room and here in the building to provide free intel, then we're able to match them to the nonprofits that we're working with and use the volunteers to let them know, hey, you've got a credential that has leaked. A volunteer can come and help you to assess the impact and to fix the issues. So we've been running a program now for over a year, taking data from the digital crime unit at Microsoft, from BitSight, Tesseract, Prodaft, a couple of other companies, and essentially matching that to the IP address and IP ranges and domain names of the non-profit that we work with. And every time there's a hit, we get a volunteer, and the volunteer comes and says, all right, we're going to fix that SQL vulnerability, we're going to fix that credential that has leaked, and basically helps them prioritize those alerts, which is a big problem, I guess, alert fatigue. I don't know if you've been downstairs, but there's a lot of people telling you that there's a lot of things happening in your network. How do you prioritize? Back to the original discussion, how do you prioritize when you have no one to differentiate between something critical and something non-critical? Well, non-profits, they don't differentiate. They just don't take care of cyber. So having that volunteer take that threat intel is another way that they can help.
Awesome. I think another question that I have is around scalability. How often do you feel like you have to spread awareness for the concept of cyber volunteer clinics or models themselves? Is that a challenge that you face in your kind of day-to-day work in terms of kind of spreading just awareness about what cyber volunteer programs are? And I'll start with you, Sarah.
Yes. I mean, only half of you had heard of clinics that are not related to cybersecurity. So you're looking at the marketing team for cybersecurity clinics. Thankfully, we have great programs, right? It's really easy to talk about the work that students do around the country. It's really heartwarming. I'm very lucky that I get to work with students from different universities. They're the smartest folks that I've ever met. If you feel trepidation about the idea of a student giving you cybersecurity advice, I can assure you that they're just true professionals and are punching way above the weight that you would expect from folks in undergraduate. So yes, it is a constant challenge to tell people about these programs. But I think that's sort of the benefit of a grassroots movement, right? We're not here banging our gavel telling people this is the right solution. We get to sort of elevate stories from across the country of folks doing good work. I love getting to talk about different clinics besides Berkeley, so I will do so. So Indiana University is actually working with their local fire department, and they got featured in the news, you know, in the fire truck talking to the firefighters about cybersecurity. Like, that's what they do day in and day out. So I think the stories tell themselves, and it's just sort of our job to tell more people about them. I'm hoping that folks in this audience have relationships with their local community colleges, or maybe your alma mater, and maybe, you know, folks in this audience today will be instrumental in starting clinics around the country. So yeah, it's a privilege.
Awesome, Adrian.
I mean, yeah, we're all nascent, as Matt, you were pointing out earlier. So obviously, getting the word out there that we're here to help takes a lot of effort. I think we can count on network effects, the idea that the more nonprofits we serve, the more volunteers are going to be interested, and so more volunteers are going to come, and so we can service more nonprofits, and it can grow like that. There's a lot of word of mouth that happens in the third sector. Nonprofits talk to each other. We got lots of referrals, you know, from one nonprofit to the other. Volunteers also talk to each other. Hey, are you volunteering? There are students also, and so I think that over time these initiatives are going to grow, but we don't want them to grow just organically without any form of, without any vision, without any direction. And so that's where CISA is helping us to channel that energy and to structure the way in which volunteer networks can be structured tomorrow to really become a force for good. And, you know, we've discussed that vision a couple of times already, but I'm probably sure everyone in the room knows Anonymous. Despite their name, you probably know who they are. They also got you know, good branding and good marketing with the Guy Fawkes mask. Well, why can't we create a counter Anonymous, which would be a force for good, right? Uniting volunteers all around the world in a mission to protect the most vulnerable instead of attacking the richest. So there's a lot that we can do, provided we get together, we think through, we avoid competition, and yeah, we start planning ahead.
Yeah, and actually, that's something worth foot stomping. I think that there's a world in which what we're all advocating for is that the national government starts a sort of nationwide cyber volunteering corps. And that's actually not what any of us are advocating for. We're actually really proud of this decentralized group that really relies on local trust to create relationships between folks in need and folks who can provide those skills and services. So I think that's something that CIS has been incredibly supportive of too, is the idea that we're stronger by creating things that serve the unique needs of different communities, and then working together to share best practices and coordinate amongst many programs, to include both of our programs, but also a number of other initiatives under Craig Newmark's Cyber Civil Defense Initiative. So there's actually lots and lots of nonprofits and academic institutions doing good work in this field, and our goal is to make sure that we're all working in tandem so that the work we produce is more than the sum of its parts, right? Not to create a very top-down structure where someone's giving out commands and everybody's following. Like, I think that this version is actually working much better.
I love that. And so I think, Adrian, you had mentioned that all of these organizations are very nascent, right? And I think one thing that I'm interested in is, what are some of the lessons learned over the past, 5 to 10 years in this space around what works in terms of cyber volunteer, in terms of organizing across the country, and where are there opportunities for more growth?
I think it would be presumptuous of me to say what works. What I can tell you is what we've been doing and what we see is working for the moment. We're supporting 270 nonprofits. We've got over 1,000 volunteers from around 50 different companies, many in the US, but also in other countries. Actually, the nonprofits we support are themselves present in over 50 countries and serving beneficiaries of vulnerable communities in over 190 countries. And so, my tips and tricks there are really to, even if you want to keep those efforts at local level and as decentralized as possible, it doesn't mean that you can just let them wander off on their own, right? You need to come up with the right tools, the right processes for these organizations to collaborate. And that's where having collaboration with CISA, with the other folks from the Cyber Civil Defense Initiative, with CLTC allows us to really find synergies and complement each other. But a lot of effort goes into organizing those efforts. For instance, in my team, we've got a product manager, software engineer, we've got a community manager, we've got 2 people looking after operations, we've got somebody expert in NGOs. Those people are paid full-time to do just the volunteer initiative. And we're now embarking on being a lot more present in the US. I'm working with a law firm called McDermott Law & Emery, and every time I talk to these lawyers, they tell me that we're potentially doing very dangerous things, right? When some of my volunteers, our volunteers, are advising nonprofits on how to negotiate a ransom, not to say that they're directly negotiating the ransom with criminals on behalf of the nonprofit, which happened in a couple of cases. The lawyers, alarm bells go off the chart, and they tell us all sorts of things that we need to start thinking about. So if we're thinking about this, others in the US, in the different states, are probably also starting to think about it. If not, they should. And so we can collaborate on all of those things. There's, for instance, a nonprofit that got set up recently in Boston called Municipal Cyber, who's looking at grabbing volunteers from industry to help the local municipal services. And so those organizations that are not nascent, but that are born very recently, can leverage the tools and the processes and all of the lessons that we are amassing together with Sarah. So hopefully in the very short term, we can put all that together and find ways to plug in all of those organizations so everyone can complement our work, and we can all serve better these communities that have been a little bit forgotten.
Awesome. And I think a lot of this discussion is really focused on public-private partnership, collaboration. And so Sarah and Adrian, I know that you two work very closely in talking about kind of what's next for cyber volunteerism. And so what are some of the opportunities that you're thinking about looking at over the next several years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think at the core of it, I don't think we have a good vision for what structure we need in place in the country, whether or not government, private sector, nonprofit sector, to make sure that these organizations have what they need to not be regularly hit with low-level cyber attacks. I don't think that we have a strategy for that. And I don't think the strategy should be that every single small organization in the country needs to hire a full-time cybersecurity expert. I don't think that's sustainable. And with those 2 pieces of information, I think what we hope to do is, work with all the organizations that are running these volunteering programs, in particular because they're very in touch with the local organizations that need assistance. They really know what's working and what's not working for different subsectors of these low-resource organizations, and work together not only to coordinate better to make sure that our programs are feeding into each other, that we have as much coverage as possible for these organizations that really have nowhere else to turn, and that we can plan in the long term, how do we shift the responsibility away so that our programs are helpful, but not where the buck stops for these organizations, right? When we're talking about critical infrastructure like wastewater, like energy, we really should not be where the buck stops. We need something else in place to make sure that communities are not devastated by cyber attacks, as we see that they so constantly are. Every week it's a school, it's something in energy, there's a hospital that's hit by ransomware, and it feels like there's nothing we can do about it. And so I think it's both important that our programs continue to serve because we can, and I'd love for our programs to be less important in the long term, right? I'd love for our programs to be more focused on workforce development than defending critical infrastructure because no one can. And I simply don't think that we have a plan for that yet, and would love to be part of the group that puts one together.
Yeah, I'll build on that. I think we need the short term those cyber volunteer initiatives are filling a critical gap. So they need to continue, they need to be well funded, they need to be able to protect those that are not being protected until policymakers are able to find systemic solutions. I didn't mention that, but the Cyber Peace Institute doesn't do just volunteering. We also have an analysis department and an advocacy department. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is effect systemic change through the work that we do on the ground with the nonprofits. So we advise governments, we put in papers at the United Nations level, the Paris Peace Forum, the IGF and others, to try and tell policymakers how they're failing to protect the most vulnerable. And there's governments that are starting to pick up the topic. You have 2 representatives of CISA here today. Other governments are slowly, getting to grasp with that issue. One way to also bring the attention of government is, if you're not offering cybersecurity protection in the digital age to nonprofits, they're probably going to flee your country at some point. And this is a discussion that's prime in our interactions, for instance, with the city of Geneva and the city of The Hague, which are both hosts of vast and large international organizations, the UN, the Red Cross, the International Court of Justice. And for them, extending cybersecurity protection is equally as important as extending physical protection in the case of a terrorist attack. And so that's one first angle to get policymakers to consider that as host nations for those activities, they can and should do better. Another angle, and you alluded to this, Sarah, is critical protection. I worked in the government for a couple of years. I'm French originally, and we have a similar doctrine when it comes to critical infrastructure as the US and pretty much every Western country out there. And that doctrine, if I'm not too mistaken, is rooted in kinetic warfare and a game of numbers. So essentially, you're trying to protect the biggest amount of people and trying to reduce to the minimum the level of impact they're going to suffer in the case of an attack. But that kinetic age still exists, and Putin made some big threats very recently around using nuclear weapons again. But digital threats are also a lot more pervasive than they were 20 years ago. And with the technologies that we have, a single digital disinformation campaign can lead somebody to kill themselves, can lead a patient in a hospital to get refused access to critical healthcare and to potentially lose their lives. And so we need to start considering critical infrastructure not just in terms of how do we protect the most people and limit the amount of impact that they're going to suffer, to how can we prevent the most vulnerable people from ever being impacted. So it's a bit of a paradigm shift. I'm probably not phrasing correctly, which is why I'm no longer doing policy making and let that to others. But there's an element there for us to reconsider in terms of should the third sector, should civil society be considered critical? And if so, what kind of protection could they receive from states? A lot of the nonprofits we work with, when we tell them, have you talked to the police? Yes, we tried, but the police tells us they don't have time for us, they don't have the resources, they are going to handle the big cases for the big organization, the critical infrastructure operators, not the local nonprofit. Yes, but we're saving lives. Like we're working, for instance, with a nonprofit here in the US that's working with people that have AIDS. And they're dealing with very sensitive patient health data, and they're a very small team, 15 people, had no IT staff, no cybersecurity staff. When Change Healthcare got attacked I think it was a couple of months back, they lost access to a lot of the records. They got scared that a lot of the data they had inputted could be potentially leaked and have those people at threat, of having their personal health data being leaked. Is that not critical? I bet you for these people, this is critical. Can we start thinking about critical infrastructure no longer in terms of numbers, but also in terms of criticality?
Yeah, and just to respond to that a little bit. So CISA's mandate is to protect critical infrastructure, right? But I think we are increasingly starting to look more at how kind of the overlap between digital and physical threats and the particular impact that they have on nonprofits and organizations that are at heightened risk of being targeted by advanced adversaries because of who they are or what they do. So organizations that are working for democracy and for human rights are much more often in the crosshairs of APTs. And so JCDC, which is a subdivision within CISA, actually just started a planning effort to provide cybersecurity protections to those types of communities. And that's actually how we met Sarah and Adrian. So I think it is definitely, it is a process, but I think CISA definitely is starting to really understand that linkage between the digital and physical threats that these communities are frequently under, and kind of factoring that into our work more and more. Sarah, you had mentioned something earlier that I kind of want to come back to, which was that you eventually would like for your organizations to be less important, which I think is honestly the greatest goal, to like work yourselves out of a job, right? I am curious, so in your engagements with organizations, at some point the engagement ends, right? And so I'm curious what you kind of do to make sure that when that engagement is over, that organization isn't going back to square one and that they're better off than when they started.
Yeah, for sure. I think implementation is a really important piece of this, and that's part of the reason why we work so well with the Cyber Peace Institute. The students are really there to give them the first 3 to 5 things that they need. Put them in order, give them some toolkits if they can. But for the most part, this will not come as a shock to folks, but institutes of higher education are very risk-averse institutions. The idea of students putting hands on keyboard and actually doing a network scan, some of them have been incredibly successful at clearing those hurdles, and others prefer to just stay in the risk assessment category. So I don't think that clinics are really where implementation lies, but like I said, I think what we're doing is we're building a patchwork of different organizations that provide different pieces of the puzzle, and the more of those we can create and connect to each other, the more we have a network that's sort of a safety net for these organizations. So we haven't mentioned yet, but the state-run Incident Response Corps, where actual state employees or volunteers are coming in and being the incident response team for an organization that maybe doesn't have one on retainer, those are also programs that are part of this patchwork, right? We're very much on the preventative side, and they're more on the incident response side, and I think all of them are really critical, and what's most critical is that we work together so that if they're like, can you guys help, this hasn't happened yet, but if someone asks the clinic if we can help with incident response, we're like, we don't do that, but we know who does. Do you live in this state? We can put you in touch with someone. So I think that's the eventual goal with these programs.
I love that. Okay, so there are only 5 minutes left, so I have one question for each of you. And if we have extra time, we can also do audience questions. But if there was one thing that you would want the audience to take away from today's discussion, what would it be? I'll start with you, Matt.
Great. Well, I guess that there's always an opportunity to engage at a local level. You just have to find it. It's not always easy. It might come through a formal mechanism like a clinic or a volunteer chapter through something like Cyber Peace Institute, but it also might come from just working with your kid's school district to go in and give them a quick assessment, right? Any little bit helps for these target-rich, resource-poor organizations. We're excited to find more formal ways and sort of build that from the ground up, but even in the lack of that, folks still have channels to pitch in if that's what they want to do, if you feel so inspired today.
Yeah. I would say 6 or 7 years ago, every single program that we're talking about did not exist, including CISA as an agency. So that should inspire you. We're really responding to an emerging problem where everyone is starting to realize that we need to help these organizations. We don't quite know what to do. All of these were ideas a couple years ago, and now we're actual full-fledged programs, and we're helping people. So if you folks have ideas, if you're connected with your local university, if you want to be a volunteer for the Cyber Peace Builders, this is your calling card. Join us. I think it's a really important fight. I think it's a fight that starts at the local level in you and your own communities, in the volunteers and the folks that you care about. So I really hope that you guys will join us and be a part of the patchwork that we're trying to put together for cyber civil defense. Sorry.
What can I add? I always think that if we're unable to solve that issue, to protect those that shouldn't be attacked in the first place, then we will have failed collectively. Everyone in that building, we will have failed to create a safe technology, and we will live a horrendous legacy to our children. I don't want that to happen. I think, and I still think, I was born in that era, that the internet is full of promises, that we can achieve great things with it. But we got to make sure that there's a baseline that's not crossed, that those folks that need protection are not attacked. And all it takes is an hour of your time, a couple of times a month or a couple of times a year. It's not difficult. It's the same message that we're giving to the nonprofits that I hope you're getting in that industry, is that although cyber sounds complex, with very little, you can actually get a lot better. You can improve the situation a lot. And there's a whole community of people. There's just 4 of us here, but we know hundreds and thousands of people that are trying to do good at all levels of industry and government and civil society. And there's this movement that's brewing, that's growing, and I hope that you can take part and help us.
Amazing. I think those are great words to end on. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll be around after the panel if you want to ask questions. Enjoy the rest of your day.